Now, this workshop in particular is called Rising Democracies Interrupted. So the focus is principally on rising democracies. And what are rising democracies? That could be those states among the so-called rising powers, such as Brazil, South Africa, India, for example, but also Turkey and Indonesia were at some point put into this category. So those states that have been rising in the 2000s economically and that also were democracies or were developing in an ever more democratic direction, and where at that time, or still only like 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of optimism that they would also establish themselves as democratic actors on the world stage. And this category would also include young democracies from Eastern Europe and Latin America, such as Argentina, Chile, Poland, Hungary, that at a certain time also themselves being still democracies in consolidation or recently consolidated democracies became ever more active in themselves promoting or protecting democracy. So once again, shared with the democratic rising powers, this commonality of that there was a lot of optimism, a lot of expectation that these states would establish themselves as democratic powers and also, yeah, kind of help with the spread of democracy across the world. However, more recently, as we all know, there has been a lot of observations and diagnoses regarding a democratic rollback or democratic backsliding or the crisis of democracy going on worldwide. And in many countries, we have seen the rise of populist forces, parties, leaders. And at the same time, we also, in many of these former rising powers, we are seeing or have been seeing economic crisis, or the fact that the economic growth for a certain time did not, to the extent that was expected optimistically, contribute to the reduction of social inequalities. And then obviously when the economy starts to shrink again or growth is stagnating, this is also not really helping with mediating and mitigating social inequalities. There's also an increasing social and political polarization in many states. We have seen over the past year waves of protests in many countries that were for a long time considered to be stable democracies, Chile being an example. And well, of course, all these factors together give the impression that there is a crisis of democracy worldwide and that this rise of the so-called rising democracies has been halted or interrupted for the time being. So it's a much more pessimistic outlook that we are facing right now. And the call for papers for this workshop emphasized this or gave this context and then put out a number of research questions. First, kind of crisis diagnosis, so what is going on in these countries, what has happened, and how can we actually tackle this crisis of democracy? Is it that specific dimensions of democracy are particularly affected? Yeah, how can we measure this, or how can we diagnose this? How can we say that a state or democracy has entered in crisis? And then the second complex of questions was related to the causes. So what are the causes for this democratic rollback or for this stagnation of democratization processes? And then the third kind of complex of questions would be asking what are the consequences? So what changes when rising powers no longer are rising democracies, but when their democratic quality is put into doubt and that they are also no longer kind of acting as forces in favor of democracy on the world stage. And so we launched a call for papers, as I already mentioned, back in February, and received a number of interesting proposals from different world regions. And I also invited scholars from different countries, and mainly from Germany, and that is due to the fact that I represent German institutions here, and we always have an interest of specifically also bringing German scholars or scholars based at German institutions and to an exchange with partners from Brazil. And so kind of selected and invited some colleagues from Germany to participate in this debate, whose work is related to the topic of the seminar. And one set of invited participants includes our participants for this opening roundtable, which is a bit of a conjunctural roundtable, if you want. So taking this current pandemic and the global crisis that we are, or the global turbulences that we are all facing around the world, and that has also caused this event to be one that is hosted online and not on campus at the University of Sao Paulo, as a starting point to analyze to what extent the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic are having an effect on democracy, or could potentially affect the quality of democracy. So the quality of democracy in times of COVID-19 will be the topic of our roundtable today in this opening session. And of course, there are a number of topics or questions one could raise related to this question, how the quality of democracy is affected by a global pandemic situation like this. And one is a big question that has come up in previous crises as well, which is the trade-off between the protection of lives or protection of health on the one hand, and the preservation of freedom and political liberties in particular on the other hand. And we can see that there is often a trade-off, that all these lockdowns and restrictions that are being put to protect health and to protect the lives actually of people are restricting individual freedoms. And this has also in many countries led to protests against these measures, or led to a lot of controversies among the responsible politicians of how this crisis should be managed. And it is of course also interesting to look to what extent democracies and autocracies, or democracies of a different quality, are different in their responses to the pandemic. So is there a systematic difference between the regime type or the quality of the regime on the one hand, and the crisis response on the other hand? So in that sense, the regime type would be, if you want, the independent variable. But you can also turn the question around, of course, and ask, how does the management of the pandemic affect regime type in short term or also in the longer run? So can we see cases where, and we all know that there are a number of cases where leaders are using the crisis as a pretext or as a justification for restrictions to tighten their autocratic rule or to restrict freedoms in still democratic regimes. And so in that sense, the other question would be, what is the effect of global pandemic, or does this have an effect on the quality of democracy now, immediately, or in the longer run? And then, of course, the third question is, if we work with a more demanding concept of democracy, that democracy is not just procedures and the quality of institutions, but also the question, what do institutions deliver? Then a third question, or third complex of questions, if you want, would be related to the question of how do states mitigate the effects of the pandemic? So looking at, for instance, especially in contexts where large sectors of the population are working in informal jobs and are highly affected by any restrictions of public life, lockdowns, prohibitions to leave the house, etc. Contexts where we have a high level of inequality anyway. So how can the state then deal with the fallout of the economic crisis that inevitably is a consequence of lockdowns and curbing economic actions and curbing the daily life? So how can states, democratic states, and or governments in general deal with this? How can they mitigate these effects by using appropriate social policies to address the needs of the population, and to avoid in the longer run that inequality becomes worse and worse, and that this also then leads to social unrest that can challenge the political regime. So you can see that there are a number of potential implications how the pandemic is affected by the quality of democracy or regime type more general, and how the management of the pandemic itself can, in the short run or in the long run, affect the political regime type and the quality of democracies if we are dealing with democratic regimes. And so I would like to pose these questions to our panelists today, and I'm very happy that we have 3 panelists covering different aspects of these questions and different regions or different countries also. I have to announce that unfortunately Wolfgang Merkel, who had originally accepted to be on this roundtable, cannot be with us this morning because of an urgent family matter. He had to cancel his participation. However, we have 3 panelists here, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. So we have Merike Blofield here with us, who is the director of the GIGA Institute for Latin American Studies and also a professor of political science at the University of Hamburg in Germany. And she actually joined GIGA only this year, a few months ago. And before, she was a professor at the University of Miami. And as you can guess from the fact that she directs the Latin American Studies Institute, she's an expert on Latin America and will also talk about the case of, or the context of Latin America in the pandemic. Then as a second presenter today, we have Karabekir Akkoyunlu, who is right now based here in Sao Paulo. He's a visiting scholar or visiting professor at the International Relations Institute of the University of Sao Paulo, and also a research associate at the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. So coming from the European context and to Brazil, and studying in his research both Turkey and the Middle East, and more recently also Brazil in comparative perspective. And today he'll give us an outlook on the situation in Turkey. And then I'm very happy that on very short notice we found, I found a replacement to jump in and join us for the panel and sort of cover similar topics than what Wolfgang Merkel would have addressed, but with a different methodological approach, if you want. And I'm very happy to welcome also my colleague Gabriel Cepaluni, who is a professor of international relations here at Sao Paulo State University, UNESP. So it's a university that is also based in Sao Paulo, but also in different places across the federal state of Sao Paulo. And he in particular is based at the branch in Franca, which is a city in the north of the state of Sao Paulo. And he recently was a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Central European University, Budapest, which seeing the paper that is going to be the basis for his contribution today, he also collaborated with colleagues from Central European University. And so despite being from Brazil, is more focusing on the early phase of the pandemic cases, including basically cases from all over the world, but focusing on some examples also from Europe and of course the Chinese case as the first case where we had known infection cases, and comparing how different political regimes actually managed the early outbreak of the crisis. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Merike, and I would suggest that each of you has up to 15 minutes to give your point of view And then I'll give you the opportunity to respond to each other if you want. Then, of course, we also will have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. So please go ahead, Merike.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll try and be short because I'm actually very interested in hearing what people have to say and if they have any questions and thoughts. Thank you for this opportunity. I think this came along a couple of weeks ago when you decided to organize a panel on COVID and responses. And I have just 3 PowerPoint slides that I will show because I'll focus on my comments on social protection measures. And so it's not directly on democracy, but of course it has clear implications, and I'd be more than happy to talk about those. So let me just share, I think, sorry, I go to share screen and then I go here. And home, slideshow beginning. Can you see this COVID-19 social protection in Latin America? Excellent. Okay, and so this is actually related to a paper that we already wrote a month and a half ago with my co-author Fernando Filgueira. Some of you may know him. He's a sociologist based in Uruguay. He's worked a lot for multilateral agencies, and actually the information that we're collecting now, we're doing for a Cepal and Cepal report on social protection in Latin America in light of COVID that we hope to hand in about 1 month. So just, I mean, generally and globally, to bring it to the global level, of course, well, aside from the direct health effects, COVID-19 has had a devastating economic effect on families and households, particularly in the global south, particularly in developing countries, and particularly among low-income families who don't have assets or savings that they can draw on as the economic crisis hits, and then associated measures of social distancing and lockdown prevent many people from going to work. And also, of course, one of those measures has been to physically close schools, and as a result, now for about 2 months, we've had over 1.2 billion children out of school and daycares around the world. And as they're out of school, they also therefore are not receiving what usually they get free or subsidized school meals in a lot of public schools, especially in Latin America and also in other parts of the region. So they're missing out on that nutrition, and of course they need care and education, homeschooling from their parents or guardians at home. And the economic effects have been particularly devastating for those who are not in formal labor, which is, of course, most economically active people in the developing world, as informal sectors around the world have come to a halt. And here, low-income households with children are a particular risk in terms of simply food insecurity, of actually being able to eat over the past 2 months, and other indicators of broader well-being. And then if here's 2 graphs to bring it home to Latin America. The first one is from the most recent, but no, these are both pre-pandemic data. So the first one is the share in poverty of different demographic groups in Latin America, and poverty is very young, or in the sense that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be in poverty in Latin America. It's really marked. So if you are up to 14 years old, your chance, almost half the children in Latin America are in poverty. And then it decreases gradually until about 65 years and over, where the poverty rate, these are regional averages, is about 14%. So, as we, of course, epidemiologically, those at most risk in COVID are elderly and people with different kinds of underlying conditions, specific risk groups. But socially, the key groups at risk are households with children, mothers and children especially. And here is based on our ongoing research, which is looking at families and social policies. Here we've sort of, on the second graph on the right, we have, this is a weighted average for 9 Latin American countries. Type of household by income quintile. And so what this shows basically is the different kinds of families and household structures we see across income quintiles. If you go to income quintile 5, which is the wealthiest, 70% of those households do not have children in them. And as a result, of course, that has a different kind of impact when the economy halts and kids come home from school, right? Also, most of those people are in the formal economy and they're able to often work from home, etc., distance work. Then you go all the way to, and here you also see a very linear evolution of the different types across income quintiles. Quintile 1, where the vast majority of households have children in them. And within those households, especially monoparental households, so which the vast majority of which tend to be monomaternal, meaning they're single mother households, are also overrepresented. So 20% of those households are single mother households with children, and close to 75% are households, either with both parents, extended households, single mother households with children. And so with the pandemic, those effects are compounded in those low-income households. So what we see since COVID-19 in the last 2 months in Latin America is massive job loss in low-income households. There's one Inter-American Development Bank survey. One of the problems is that we lack systematic data, and we're trying to get different sources of funding to actually get systematic data on this. But there is one survey that was done by the Inter-American Development Bank, which is ongoing. It is based on self-report, so it has its issues, but it gives us a window. And this is across the region. It includes 15 countries. 69% of individuals in low-income households said they lost their job due to the pandemic, 70%. Most of those individuals in low-income households, from our household data, we know that they're likely the only wage earner in their households, and they're extremely likely to have children in their households, compared to just 26% in highest income households. And the former also reported unsurprisingly widespread food insecurity. So the existing government social protection infrastructure in Latin America is composed of both contributory and non-contributory social security. The vast majority of households with children live in households that do not have access to contributory social security. About 2/3, depending on the country, but about 2/3 of children live in households where there is not a single member who is actually in the formal labor force and is part of the contributory social security network. That, of course, as you know, in more advanced countries has been the main mechanism through which governments have provided social protection and income maintenance in response to the COVID pandemic. However, very importantly, non-contributory social security, so targeted social protection measures to poor households, have dramatically expanded in Latin America, and Latin America has actually been an innovator in that, in conditional cash transfers that have then spread to many other countries in the developing world. And by 2016, 20% of households in Latin America that were either poor or extremely poor received conditional cash transfers, and they tended to often be mothers with children. So you have that. So in terms of what's happened since the pandemic, by the end of March, and so this is about 2 weeks after social distancing began in Latin America, the lockdown measures, the declarations of public health emergencies, etc. It was the second week of March when most countries started putting them into place. By the end of March, over half, our data includes 17 countries, which basically includes all the democratic countries in Latin America. Cuba and Venezuela are not included. 10 out of 17 countries had used these non-contributory networks to increase cash assistance to conditional cash transfer recipients, along with also increasing assistance to those in the formal labor force. However, that of course leaves a huge sector of society completely unprotected, those who are neither in the contributory or the non-contributory system and who live off the informal economy. By the recognition and also sort of the tools to start reaching these people, the process was much slower. By the end of April, 80% of countries had extended cash assistance in varying levels with varying eligibility criteria to informal sector households that were not included in either of these other measures. Only half of these had criteria that allowed all of those who had actually lost their income to apply. So what we're looking at is the speed, sufficiency, and the breadth of these policies. And to date, there's not a single Latin American country that has been able to expand enough cash assistance to cover the basic necessities. So here we're talking like an extreme poverty level. So that basically households, vulnerable households, all vulnerable households who need it have enough money to feed their families and have the basic medicine, etc. However, there's significant variation in the extent to which they've been able to do so. And I'm happy to talk about that in question and answer. There's different political factors that are driving it and other such factors. And the existing literature can partially explain it, but then there's also some countries that are standing out with, you know, how badly they're doing versus how well they're doing. We can certainly talk about that. On a normative level, from a policy-oriented level, this is less social science, but policy is that there is a desperate need for broad and sufficient emergency social protection floors in the region that include everybody. And of course, we can link it to politics in many ways, because if you can't feed your families, it's a source for political instability. Food riots, political instability. Brigitte was talking about the impact on, you know, these protests for individual liberties, which are happening. Then there's also the protests that we have seen, which are different. For example, in some of the neighborhoods in Santiago, Chile, that certainly has the money to feed the population, but has been frankly very stingy about its cash assistance. People protesting because they simply don't have enough food to feed their families. And so we're seeing more of that take place. I'll leave my comments at that. And I really look forward to discussions about the politics and other factors that are driving these changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to look at the social policy perspective. And before we go to questions, I would like to continue and give the floor to Karabekir Akkoyunlu to talk about the case of Turkey.
Okay, thank you very much, Brigitte. I hope you can hear me fine. Thank you for organizing this conference and for the invitation. So as you've already alluded to, since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been this ongoing international debate as to which regime type is better equipped to deal with such a public health crisis. Is it authoritarianism with its ability to implement draconian measures effectively in a way that democracies cannot do? Or is it democracies, consolidated democracies, with a high level of public trust and accountability that are able to better overcome such crises? Now, one thing that this debate does is to leave out an entire spectrum of hybrid regimes, which are neither democratic nor authoritarian, and assess their interaction or reaction to the coronavirus crisis. Turkey is one such regime. It's neither a consolidated democracy, obviously, like Germany or New Zealand, which have been success stories in their response to the crisis. Nor is it a fully blown authoritarianism as China. It's somewhere in the middle. It's been labeled a competitive authoritarian regime for some years. And I find it most fascinating to assess Turkey's response and the Turkish government's response to the coronavirus crisis and look at what it reveals in a comparative framework that includes weak or declining or interrupted democracies that are being pushed towards an authoritarian direction under autocratic-minded populist leaders. So that framework includes a very diverse set of countries, from India under Modi, Hungary under Orban, Brazil under Bolsonaro, or even United States under Donald Trump. And when, for these autocratic-minded populist leaders, a public health crisis like this presents both a major challenge, but also a blessing and opportunity in disguise. It's a challenge because these leaders base their popular legitimacy and their support on effective economic performance, on their ability to deliver material benefits, especially to their supporters. And in turn, they use this success to justify their illiberal political agendas. So the economic crisis that the pandemic is causing is a major challenge for these governments, as is for other governments as well. But it's also a potential blessing in disguise, because these autocratic-minded populist leaders build their careers on creating invisible enemies, both at home and abroad, in order to legitimize permanent state of emergency type of politics and their strongman measures. Now, at this moment, there is a real invisible enemy, so to speak, which justifies more than any other time such strongman measures, from imposing lockdowns to increasing surveillance on the population. So how do these leaders react to the pandemic? And is there a sort of logic to the path they take in their response? A preliminary look, and this is basically, I'm at the hypothesis building stage as I'm presenting these thoughts to you, a preliminary look seems to suggest that the leaders' response to the crisis reflects their position and priorities the moment the crisis hit. In other words, the balance they see between the challenges and the opportunities. So in those countries where it was the economy that was the major issue at the time of the outbreak of the crisis, the tendency has been to minimize the threat from the virus and try to keep business as usual for as long as possible. So examples for this, for instance, are Trump in the United States or Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's election year in the US, and Trump's path to success goes through economic performance. And similarly in Brazil, Bolsonaro's ability to implement his far-right political agenda hinges on his success in dragging Brazil out of economic recession. So these leaders have been minimizing the threat from coronavirus and trying to keep things as normal as much as possible. For other countries where the economy was not the issue number one at that time, but rather various socio-political obstacles on their path to state capture or institutional restructuring, the tendency of the leaders has been to maximize the threat, impose draconian measures with that justification, and capitalize on it from a political perspective. So we can give the example here of Modi in India or Orban in Hungary. India under Modi has imposed far-reaching state of emergency measures, and during this period, the government has handled and took the opportunity to crush dissent. For instance, a weeks-long protests against its citizenship law, or took the opportunity to also handle the situation in Kashmir in a more authoritarian manner. And in Hungary, the government of Prime Minister Orban basically declared a rule by executive decree and passed a whole bunch of decrees that have nothing to do with the pandemic and the health crisis during this period. So Turkey reflects a mixture of both concerns about challenges, but also opportunities. But on balance, the reaction of the Turkish government has been closer to the Trump and Bolsonaro side, minimizing the threat rather than capitalizing on it. That's because at the outset of the pandemic, President Erdogan was in an institutionally dominant, but politically and economically weakened position. Economically weakened and therefore politically fragile position. And his government's response to the crisis has reflected this state of affairs. It's important that we remember the draconian transformation that the Turkish state has gone through since 2016, especially between 2016 and 2018. In 2016, Turkey suffered a failed coup attempt, which President Erdogan called a gift from God, declared a state of emergency, carried out purges in civil society and state institutions of historic proportions, and then also used the opportunity of the state of emergency to transform Turkey's political system from parliamentarism to a strong executive presidentialism. So if Erdogan did not attempt an audacious executive power grab like Orban did in Hungary, that is because that power grab had already been achieved between 2016 and 2018, and he didn't need to go that far. And in fact, the Turkish government's institutional or political response to the crisis reflects a need not to go much further, but rather to tighten the screws and maintain grip on dissent and opposition. A few examples. The parliament in April, dominated by the right-wing coalition between Erdogan's AKP government and the far-right nationalist MHP, passed an amnesty law that released about 90,000 prisoners in an attempt to prevent the spread of the virus in prisons. But the amnesty excluded all those people who were put in jail during these purges. So political prisoners, journalists, intellectuals, writers, human rights activists were excluded from the amnesty, while, for instance, gang leaders associated with this far-right nationalist coalition partner of the government walked free. Another example is a draft proposal that was brought to the parliament aimed at increasing government surveillance and censorship of major social media platforms. And there were also sustained efforts from the central government to disrupt any measure taken by opposition-held municipal governments that could contribute to the opposition's success and popularity, including suspending donation campaigns opened by these municipalities, or even shutting down soup kitchens that were catering to a rising number of unemployed and homeless people in a municipal-held city. But the real emphasis since the beginning of the pandemic, the real emphasis of the government has been the economy. And that's because the Turkish economy has been in a deepening crisis for over 2 years, with the Turkish lira having taken a nosedive and the country's foreign exchange reserves being depleted very rapidly. In fact, before the crisis hit, the Turkish government was trying to save the day by populist measures and merely kicking the can down the road. So in this sense, the pandemic came at a particularly terrible time for Turkey as a whole, but also for the Turkish government. And that's why Erdogan has continually said since the beginning of this crisis that the wheels of the economy must keep turning. And the government has resisted calls for stringent measures for as long as possible. In fact, about a month ago, we had a fairly surreal moment when everything seemed to be upside down, when civil society, large parts of the population, including civil society and left-wing groups, were calling for curfews in entire cities that were badly hit by the virus, and the government, which is usually no stranger to imposing such measures, especially when it comes to the Kurdish issue, was resisting it for as long as possible. In fact, even the interior minister at the time called people who were pushing for curfews terrorist supporters and those who were making trouble within the country. Eventually, the government came around and stricter measures were imposed, always in sort of consideration of its economic impact. And it seems that Turkey has done relatively well in terms of its response to the first wave of the pandemic. But as soon as the cases started dropping, the first thing that the government has done has been to reopen the economy. And the first places to reopen have been the shopping malls and the mosques. In other words, the two holy sites of the ruling neoliberal Islamists, where, of course, the virus is also likely to spread further and wider. So that is the picture of Turkey in a nutshell. And I will conclude by just saying, bringing in one caveat into this comparison. I'm following Turkey and the developments in Turkey, my home country, from here in Brazil, in São Paulo, and that leads to some interesting comparisons. And there are various similarities, but also one major difference, it seems, with Brazil and Turkey. Erdogan, despite his populist and polarizing rhetoric, has not gone to the lengths that the Bolsonaro government in Brazil has gone, or the Trump administration in the United States has done, in contesting basic scientific evidence. It seems that Erdogan belongs to an earlier generation of populist leaders whose limits, I mean, they're very creative as well in coming up with conspiracy theories, but peddling complete misinformation, going to the very root of scientific evidence. He didn't go that far. He didn't clash, for instance, with his health minister in a way that Bolsonaro has done. And I think more than Erdogan, what it does is it demonstrates something about Trump and Bolsonaro. These two, in my view, appear to be, and this pandemic has shown that they are in a different league, in a league of their own, not only challenging the institutions, national and international, that they're actually rising from within, but also the epistemological basis of those institutions in our societies. I'll stop at that, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for trying to bring in a comparative perspective. And I'm sure there will be a number of questions. But I would now like to invite Gabriel Cepaluni to deliver his thoughts on the topic.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Just a second. Can you all see the presentation? Hello? Can you see? Can you see the presentation?
No, I can see it.
Oh, I have to share the screen.
Yes, exactly.
I forgot that. Now, can you see my screen? No.
Yes, we can, but there's a lot of other things.
Okay, that's fine.
You are in mute now. You have to unmute yourself. I don't know why that happens sometimes. Yes.
Now I think we are ready, right?
Yes, now we're ready.
Oh, excellent. So, as Brigitte told you, I wrote this work with my friends in Budapest because I stayed there for a semester, for actually 6 months. And it was a very disturbing situation being in Europe in the end of my stay. I had to come back to Brazil earlier because I was afraid of being stuck in Europe. So when I come back, you know, I realized that I was in a different world that I never imagine that I would see one day. I'm normally very optimistic, but things change a lot. And then I realized that probably, as a researcher, COVID is probably the most important event of our times, at least from my generation, in several ways, in economic terms, in social, political aspects. So I proposed to my friends that we should study the topic, and we want to take a global perspective. So this is the title of my presentation: Political Regimes and Deaths in the Early Stages of the COVID pandemic. And for us, the results were, I think, were surprising. Not for my wife, but for us, it was surprising. We basically found that democracies in the early stages of the pandemics were doing a worse job in terms of decreasing the number of deaths. And I can tell you that this finding is not something that I like. I'm not supporting dictatorships. Actually, I'm saying that because some journalists interviewed me and published my work, some news about my work, and some people, especially the public, think I'm protecting dictatorships. Just trying to be scientific in the sense that I had a research question, and I want to answer that research question the best way I can. Of course, all empirical work have problems, but it was a surprising finding. I think it's I like to see this find as a cautionary note for us, not as a political scientist, but as citizens, because we are seeing at this moment a lot of countries decreasing their quality of democracy, or even become full authoritarian regimes like Hungary, and in Brazil right now we don't know what's gonna happen actually, and everything can happen. But I won't talk about Brazil. I will try to do that. So the debate among political theorists on the advantage and disadvantages of democratic regimes are a part of our discipline, are part of the history of our discipline. And of course, we can go back to Aristotle, but probably one of the most eloquent supporters of absolutist regimes, Thomas Hobbes. Carl Schmitt is also an important name. And of course, most liberal philosophers like John Stuart Mill or important political theorists as Robert Dahl, they always emphasize the information side of the democracy, that science and the free movement of people and information is a strong point of our democratic regimes. So I hope that with this research, I can make a small contribution to the debate about the society after COVID pandemic. And I also mentioned September 11 attacks because the September 11 attacks also was a shock in at least in the US, and some rapid measures were necessary. And most political theorists say that one advantage of dictatorships is that they don't need much of a debate to decide when making policies. So probably this is one of the advantages of dictatorships. I'm using the names democracy and dictatorship because it's easier, but in our work, we work with a scale. So we are measuring actually quality of political regimes from authoritarian to fully democratic regimes. So we selected some countries for these pictures, and I think kind of represents our arguments. Remember that we are talking about the first 100 days. Some things have changed, and now I'm not sure if our main argument has changed. I don't think so. I think if we redo the analysis nowadays, I think our results would hold. I'm not sure, but that's my intuition. But when we start to analyze this, we create this plot that's a kind of famous plot. It became famous, I think, with the New York Times. And this plot is good to show the flattening of the curve. So we are using a logarithmic scale, and we are showing deaths per capita since the first death. So as you can see, China flattened the curve very quickly, while European countries and the US were increasing the number of cases. Even Iran was performing better than most Western democracies. And here we have also Singapore, which is considered by many an example of fighting the pandemic. So we took our data from Oxford's COVID-19 government response tracker as of 7 April 2010. And our main dependent variables log death per capita. We have different dependent variables, different ways of measuring deaths in our paper, and the results still the same, basically the same. And we have several other variables as controls, mostly measure of democracies and number of airports, previous cases of SARS, testing, and etc. I won't talk much about the tables. You can, if you are interested, you can look at them at the paper. So what we can see here is that the more democratic you are, the more deaths you have. And the results pretty strong and robust to many different model specifications and different controls. of course, by now you are wondering that you do not trust the data from China. I also don't trust the data from the US, but this is another point. But we don't have perfect data, but this data is the same data that we are consuming when we watch the news, when we read the newspapers. So this is the best quality data that we have. But we try to make some adjustments. So we control for a transparency index, and the result holds. We control for index of economic data transparency, and the result holds. We only selected countries that have data on testing and different measures of testing, and the results holds even with a very small sample, less than 50 cases, 49 cases. So we changed the sample size, we control for many variables, and the result still holds. And we also use some different econometric specifications, some of which should mitigate some of the measurement problems that we have, like two-stage least squares. But the results are always the same. Here we use a survival model, which is like the perfect model for this kind of data, because we have sensor data. People are still dying, so this model takes into account that people are the number of cases are still unfolding. So what survival model does is that they count as failure the first death after the first case of COVID in the country. So you can see here that the number of democracies with higher numbers of deaths are always dominating the number of non-democracies. Now we have a binary variable to make it more visualizable, pleasant. But these are the results with controls and other specifications. So the same with a difference model, it still holds. And now we are using panel data, so the sample is different. And here it's our explanation for this finding. We see here we interact the quality of political regimes with the policy measures, with index of the policy measures, and its effects on the number of deaths. So we can see that the effects almost linear. This is not a linear model. This is a kernel model. It's a flexible model. So we can see that the dictatorships that are implementing these policies are decreasing the number of deaths. These policies are being very effective in less democratic regimes. And in full democracies, the effects is almost zero. You know, we have a lot of uncertainty because this gray part of the figure shouldn't cross zero. So we are uncertain about the effects, but we are not uncertain about the effects for less democratic regimes. So the policy measures are working better in less democratic regimes. So I think what this paper proposed debates on the trade-off between protecting lives and having a liberal democracy when facing the pandemics. And from the normative side, I think it's also important that we consider very carefully the effects of the policies that we are implementing. Maybe it's not something that I like, as I said in the beginning of the presentation. I'm not 100% happy with the situation, but this is an external, it's not on our control. But maybe, unfortunately, we should accept some restrictions temporary restrictions on our economic, our liberties, civil liberties, to protect democracy in the longer run. I know that this is a very terrible trade-off, at least until we have some better ideas how to fight the COVID. It might be testing like South Korea did, but it costs a lot of money. Maybe some countries cannot do that. Maybe after we have a treatment or we have a vaccine, maybe this trade-off will disappear. But it's very possible that situations like that will happen again. Some epidemiologists say that new pandemics are very likely. So probably we should have some mechanism in our democratic institutions to deal with these emergency cases. And my last phrase, speaking from Brazil, I think this would be necessary if you had something, because the situation is getting out of control here. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I would love to hear the questions in the end. Thank you. Thank you, Brigitte.
Thank you very much, Gabriel.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So I would like to thank once again all the presenters, and I think each of them tackled one of these aspects that I mentioned in my introductory comments, right? Like, for instance, Gabriel's presentation focusing on the question of regime types as an independent variable and which effects that might have on the management of the pandemics. Unfortunately, of course, for a workshop on the quality of democracy, the finding is not what we would like to see, yeah, as you said, rightly. But of course, we also need to reflect on what happens in the longer run, right? And this is also interlinked with Merike's topic on which social policies, not only which health policies to curb the immediate outbreak and spread of the pandemic are adopted, but also which social policies are adopted to mitigate the social and economic consequences. And this in the longer run could also then affect democracy. And then we have, of course, the example of Turkey and Karabekir giving a number of comparisons also with other cases, showing how leaders have sometimes also used the pandemic as or capitalized on the crisis situation caused by the pandemic in order to strengthen their grip on power or to implement measures that makes it easier for them to control power. So we have a number of perspectives here, and before we enter into the questions and answers, I would like to give our panelists also the opportunity, if you want, if you have any comments on your colleagues here on the panel, to respond directly, if you'd like to. So let me see. Otherwise, maybe I can start with both some questions I would have on my own, and also some questions that are coming in from the audience. It's a bit of a challenge here because we have different channels, as you might see. We have this questions and answers tool and the chat. So I'm trying to kind of condense and collect the questions from there. So maybe starting with Merike Blofield's presentation. You mentioned that in terms of the responses, social policy responses, well, not only the type of responses and the intention or intensity of responses, if you want, but also kind of the question of how many % of the needy population are actually reached by these policies, that all these issues vary a lot across countries. And so I wonder, is there any systematic difference between the countries? Like, can we see that countries with populist leaders act differently from countries that do not have populist leaders, or do more democratic countries perform better than others?
Right. Well, in terms of the actual sort of needs covered of households, like I said, we don't have good systematic data. I think that's a big problem, and it would be great to have that. So I can speak about the policies and their intentions, their declared budgets, and what seems to be happening on the ground from media reports and other news. That, well, yes, I mean, I think probably the audience and the panelists here are perfectly aware of sort of the catastrophic governance of Bolsonaro during this pandemic. What's interesting in Brazil, though, is that his vacuum of leadership has brought the opposition and governors and other parties together and civil society in a way that they were not together, unified. And for example, in Brazil, at the end of March, Congress unanimously approved the Renda Básica, the minimum income guarantee, that was not supported by Bolsonaro or his minister, Guedes, until it was happening, and then they took ownership of it. There's all sorts of problems related to implementation, and that's to an extent the fault of Bolsonaro and, you know, his, you know, incompetence or whatever you want to call it. So you see these kinds of different paths, right? And so even in this case of Bolsonaro, you see the development of this minimum income guarantee. Other countries like Argentina was really at the head of this, and I would say that his government is not populist. It was a lefty, even like somewhat technocrat, I would even say, although maybe it's a misnomer when I think of his Minister of Economy, who came in from being a researcher at Columbia University. And so we see some surprising people. Peru has extended a universal family income. In Peru, you have this almost accidental president who took over after an impeachment and doesn't plan to run again, and is quite a technocrat, and he's not lefty, and he's pursuing more universalistic policies now. And so you see this variation that is not predicted by perhaps these kinds of easy classifications. Mexico has done a very bad job. And that's also AMLO, a populist. Nicaragua is no longer even populist, it's an authoritarian regime. They've been disastrous. So yeah, I mean, clearly governments that are populist as executives have shown to be terrible in terms of management of the crisis and promoting the public good and the basic needs of people in Latin America. It was interesting what Gabriel was saying. I had a bunch of questions related to, of course, questioning the dependent variable, and can we trust, how much can we trust the death rates of non-democracies, etc., and sort of the short time frame. And another question, yeah, and I think one thing is correlation, other thing is causation. I mean, it's very important to see the different causal paths in these different countries. Like, how do governments, regardless of the regime, react? And there you see democracies that are doing really well, and you see, like, for example, also the trust in government is increasing. In Peru and Argentina, the ratings of the performance of the presidents have been extremely high. That might change. I mean, the story hasn't been written yet. We don't know what's going to happen in 1 month, 6 months, a year from now. But I don't think democracies are failing. It's other factors that's going on, really other factors, like the type of regimes we have in the US and Brazil, where they're failing. But like evidence-based democracies, you know, Argentina, New Zealand, Denmark, Germany, Finland, South Korea, they're not failing at all so far. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great, thank you. I would like to kind of gather a little bit questions that have come in here via different channels. And I suggest we collect some, and then I would give it, there are also a number of questions that are directed to the entire panel, not to individual participants. So for instance, there's one question directed to Gabriel. Very varying findings, but looking at the Brazilian case, how would you access democracy? I think it's a case of low-level democracy, if democracy at all, and catastrophic reaction, and regarding the number of deaths also. Another question is the reliability of data. Regarding the death rates, democracy could report data with more transparency. That also relates to the question that Merike has mentioned, right? So how do you deal with the quality of data and the suspicion that authoritarian regimes might not be very transparent in sharing the data? So that would be one question directed to Gabriel. Then we have here a question to the entire panel. There are a number of examples of democratic states that dealt with the crisis quite well, among them Germany, Finland, New Zealand. How do these fit into the picture? So I should mention who posed the question. So in this case, it was Claudia Wiesner, a colleague from Germany, and the question before directed to Gabriel was posed by Andrea Ribeiro Hoffmann, here from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Here we have Jabaria Seha with a question for Merike. In the content of social protection measures, will people be more income poor or multidimensionally poor? So is the effect more related to income or to other dimensions of poverty as well? Let me see. There were a number of questions also to Karabekir, which he already answered in this Q&A. I didn't even know that was possible. Maybe just to add a related question, Karabekir, you mentioned in your introductory remarks that populist authoritarian leaders, and you mentioned a number of examples, have basically different ways of dealing with the crisis. Some tried to or are still trying to minimize the threat, while others are capitalizing on the crisis and trying to use the crisis to strengthen their own position. So do you have any hunch why there is this different reaction? So I would leave it at this. These are already a number of questions, and give all of you the opportunity to respond.
Let's go. Who should go
I don't
first?
know who to start.
Well, I already talked, so why don't the other two panelists go?
Sure.
You
So
decide, Brigitte.
Okay, so maybe if you want to respond, because there were a couple of questions directed specifically to you.
Okay, so I try my best to answer all the questions. If I don't answer anything, you can tell me. Regarding Brazil, it's and regarding a specific case like South Korea, Germany, and other cases. We are looking for the median effect. Of course, if you are interested, you can. I hope that in the paper is clear that we don't say that all the democracies are alike and all the dictatorships are alike. Probably it's very possible that some democracies will be doing very well in fighting the pandemic. And also the fighting is restricted to the first 100 days. Like we are talking of emergency crisis, like this is the goal. I'm truly a believer in democracy. I think most measures they are doing well. I'm from this generation of political scientists. That's it's a kind of we have a kind of triumphalism in democracies. It's part of our training. It's part of our history. But other philosophers were not like that. So I trust that democracies perform well in most situations. Other situations, I'm not so clear. And in this case, I think our results indicate that, unfortunately, democracies are not doing very well. Of course, if we discuss case, Brazil is the epicenter of the pandemic now. We, as someone asked, according to our data, Brazil is a democracy. It's not a fully democracy, but it's doing, according to this data, probably 9 in the 0 to 10 point scale. And it's around 9, I don't remember by heart. And we are doing very badly. The United States are doing terribly bad. And Spain, France, and Italy did very badly. So it's, but the idea is not to choose cases. The idea is to analyze the whole spectrum. And we wrote this paper 1 month ago. So it also was an early response to the pandemic. And we are pretty clear that we don't expect to be the last word on the topic. It's kind of our dream that people engage with the research and they show more details. Probably there's some effects for populism, for countries that are have hybrid regimes. We kind of analyze that in our data, but we don't focus on that. About the data, we are very conscious that the data is not perfect. But again, it's the data that we are being informed by the journalists and the media, and normally we take this data without thinking. Like the first plot that I showed to you, I've seen in many places, and people don't question the plot. Of course, when you put in a research paper, it should be more rigorous. But we did many things to try to mitigate the problem. The first thing was, in terms of econometrics, instrumental variables should solve the problem if we have a good instrument. I can explain that more if you are interested. But if you have a good instrument, we should minimize the underreporting cases because we control it by cases, and all the missing data in the right side of the equation should be mitigated. But we also control it for many other variables, like transparency index, like information and accountability transparency index. So the assumption is that if governments lie about information accountability, we should see a correlation between these and the number of deaths. So we control it for that. We control it for economic data transparency index. We restrict the sample to countries that are testing. They have testing data, different measures of testing. And in the end, our sample is very small, and we also excluded, we excluded from the analysis the 10 first countries, the number of cases. I didn't show that, but I have this in my slides. So at the time, I excluded Belgium, China, France, Germany, Iran, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, United Kingdom, and United States from the sample. And the results hold. If I exclude China, it holds. If I exclude Iran, it holds. And also, we also use another measure. It's only about the quality of democracy. So we only have democracies. And the same pattern exists when you restrict the analysis only for democratic countries. So actually, unfortunately, the quality of democracies are an obstacle for fighting the pandemics. Because I think the argument's pretty clear, is that in democracies, people have different goals and different opinions, and you have to have collective decision making. While especially in high state capacity dictatorships that don't have, actually there are other research that shows that if you don't face election in the near future, you perform better. So this corroborates our findings as well. But I agree that the data is not perfect. And I think someone is asking me about state capacity. And we also controlled for some measures of state capacity. I didn't show that, but we did that in the paper. One idea that we had is maybe the fight is conditioning on Asian democracies, because the pandemic started in China and in Asia, and these are where democracies have higher state capacities. But I don't want to speculate about the findings, but I've been reading some news from Africa as well. And it seems that they are doing very well. Some dictatorships in Africa are doing very well. So maybe it would be interesting to replicate the research in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Kara, you want to comment on some of the questions that were raised?
Yeah, sure. First, to briefly respond to your question, why there seems to be this different reaction from the leaders in the path they choose, whether they maximize the threat or minimize the threat. I think it boils down to the economy, and more specifically where economic issues are on the list of priorities of the leaders at the time of the outbreak. So as I tried to explain in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, where the economy was the main thing that they really needed to do well, it seems to have been a minimizing sort of path they choose, where the main issues on the agenda were sort of the political power struggles relating to this institutional restructuring. There appears to be a tendency towards maximizing the threat and capitalizing on it. But this is, of course, this remains to be tested. It's a preliminary observation, if you will. But I think it might be easier to sort of observe and draw out some patterns regarding governments' responses and why they respond in certain ways, than to draw conclusions about why some countries are doing better than others. I think we're still at a very early stage, And there are so many different variables that seem to impact the results that oftentimes I think we will find out more about this complexity as this process continues. So, for instance, I see a distinction between well-managed consolidated democracies and poorly run fragile democracies in terms of their ability to respond. I mean, I guess that comes down to state capacity in a certain at a certain point, but also to a level of public trust, accountability, coordination between different branches of government, which is higher in certain democracies than others. But there's also socioeconomic factors. Higher the social inequality, the more difficult it seems for states or governments to tackle crises like this. United States, Brazil are two good examples. South Korea, Finland are other examples. But then there are some elements that are, these we could say were predictable elements and we could test them. But then when we look into specific country cases, there we can see certain factors that we would not have even, imagined. So for instance, Turkey, as I said, seems to have done fairly well in terms of minimizing the fatality rate, even though there have been high number of cases, they spiked up rapidly. The death rate has been relatively low, and so there were attempts to explain by various scholars why this was the case, and among various explanations, one of them being young demographics. So young people are likelier to survive, etc. One very interesting finding came out. Turkey has much higher capacity per capita for ICU beds, intensive care unit beds, and CT scans than Europe, for instance. Why is that? It's a relatively young population. Why is that the case? Turns out this has to do with the privatization of health sector, and the sort of a corruption related to it, because the more the health services, emergency services are state funded in Turkey. So if a patient goes to a private hospital and cannot pay for it, the state will have to pay for their funding. So, and the most expensive funds, most expensive treatments have to do with the ICU and the CT scans. So a lot of private hospitals have been building a lot of capacity for intensive care units, pushing patients unnecessarily into these kind of treatments, keeping them there for a long time, and making the state pay the bill. But in this kind of a crisis, there is the unexpected outcome that all of a sudden Turkey has a lot of ICU capacity. And that meant that it never had the sort of threat of overwhelming its health system. There were a lot of beds that were available, and that led to people being able to, survive. Even those who were sick were able to get the treatment they needed in a way that, for instance, was an issue in New York, was an issue in Italy, North Italy, or in Rio in Brazil. So I think we're really discovering a lot of new things that will, upend our expectations and predictions in very creative ways. I guess that's it. The other questions I tried to answer already in the question and answer.
Can I add a couple of thoughts? I mean, that was so interesting because I was like thinking to myself and hypothesizing. And one of the things I was wondering is also with this, like, well, I still have an issue with the death rates. And I'd like to just reiterate what Karabekir said. Well, first of all we can't rely on media and journalist reports from authoritarian countries. And I think it's too early to be able to assess. We'll only be able to make a sort of a more systematic analysis of this issue of deaths like a year from now, because in many countries it hasn't even peaked yet, and so it's very hard. It's kind of a truncated dependent variable. I mean, interesting as the analysis is, and it sparks so much interesting, like it's all making us think. I think it's hard to do it at this point yet. And then I was thinking, well, the state of public health care is also an important factor. And to me, it seems that one of the things that makes countries better able to cope with this, not just health-wise, but socially, is the existing system of socialization of risks. I mean, if risks aren't socialized, and that also taps into what Karabekir said about inequalities. Like societies that have no socialization of risk, where everybody's in it for themselves, you can't like lock them down and then not let them get income and have access to healthcare. And countries that had that system in place were able to do it so in a much more coordinated way. But then the case of Turkey is a fascinating exception. Germany also has a somewhat idiosyncratic history of having a very high number of hospital beds per capita. That has to do with decentralization, and also I think I'm not sure if it has to do with the privatization of the hospitals, because the hospitals in Germany in general are private, but they are very, very highly regulated. Brigitte might know more about that. So that's an interesting idiosyncratic factor. But I think the issue of socialization of risks as a point of departure, that also feeds into state capacity, might be driving some of these differences. And then finally, like the death rates don't necessarily translate into, another question then is, do higher deaths translate into a criticism of government performance or not? That's another question, right? Which would then lead to like a reduction in democratic trust. Like the trust in public institutions and democracy, it will only happen if the people perceive that the deaths are directly responsibility of government incompetence, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a number of interesting issues on the table, and which of course have a number of implications also for the future of democracy. There are a number of questions that have been raised by the audience here in the Q&A and in the chat, including by Ela Tevari and by Mushtaq Wani, many of which are quite broad. And so I was a bit hesitant to address them here because some of them have also been addressed already in the roundtable by the various contributions. But let me just try to summarize them a little bit into a final round of questions. So there are a number of problems on the table: poverty, unemployment, inequality, some of which was pre-existent, some of which was made worse now by the pandemic. Social security, public safety or / protection of lives. And then, well, one fundamental question is there any systematic difference that we can see between democracies and dictatorial systems in dealing with these issues? And as I said, this has partly been already addressed by the contributions of the panelists. And then also looking towards the future, looking at these competing issues, and sometimes it's very different to prioritize with what to do first. So what do you think, how will states address these issues after the crisis, if we ever get to the stage where we can say that we have in a post-COVID situation? So how do you think there will be a list of priorities, which of these problems to address first? When we think about these different or this trade-off, well, between life's protection of life and health on the one hand, and the protection of liberty on the other hand, social protection comes in here as well, the revitalization of the economy, and all of them are to some extent interlinked. So, so what is your suggestion? Well, a very, very broad question here. What type of world order will emerge after post-COVID? It's probably very broad, but more concretely, what do you think? How will states deal with these issues? Do you think that they will have a certain, or what is your hunch, which list of priority will they have? What will they do first in order to maybe achieve other goals? And is that in any way different between different types of regimes? So once again, who would like to start? I know it's a different complex or difficult complex because it's so kind of a big question, but so you are allowed to just speculate. Of course, we all know that we are in a situation that is still dynamic and developing, and we don't know when it's going to end. And also in many countries, we don't know what the final outcome is going to be in terms of the economic effects, in terms of the deaths that the country will have to register. So it's very speculative.
If I can jump in, Britta, what you said in the end is very important and maybe explains a bit the hesitancy on the panel to commit to any analysis, because there's so much unknown, and especially if this situation, as it seems to be happening, drags on and off for a considerable period of time. I mean, think about it. It has been barely, what, 2 months, 2.5 months since, serious lockdown measures have been imposed, not even in many cases. If this goes on for another year, the impact, the global impact will be, I think there will be some black swan effects that we're probably not thinking about yet, but also some of those that we can think and we should try to sort of prevent. And some people are already, some institutions are already sounding the alarm bell on, are things like disruptions in food distribution networks and the kind of food crises that this can lead to. Already the world, I mean, I think UN has been warning about some hundreds of millions of people pushed into hunger and poverty already with regards to what's going on. And the explosive effects of those things, I think, and when one thinks about that in the long term, one shudders at the possibilities that could arise out of that, but also that reminds us that we need to think about them and take precaution. Now, the question is, which agency to take precaution through? I mean, obviously the WHO through this process has revealed the sort of the limitations and shortcomings of international organizations and the sort of national politics that seep into these international organizations. I think on the other side, this process has so far deepened nationalisms and national boundaries in a way because it's necessary. So you look at New Zealand. New Zealand has pretty much eradicated, it almost seems, the coronavirus within its national boundaries, but to maintain that situation, it needs to remain closed to the outside world, more or less, or really put everyone who's coming in under very vigilant quarantine. So that means that national boundaries are going up even stronger now. That, I think, will be a big challenge going forward in terms of, what that means for globalization, international solidarity, and nationalism as an ideology moving forward. I think one final note is, so far what this crisis has seen, it has accentuated and brought more to surface inequalities within societies and within countries, as well as between countries around the world. On the one side, there's a positive sort of effect, one reason for hope. The more these things are visible, more people and different communities might take stance against them, one would hope. But on the other side, the more entrenched these fault lines become, the more hierarchical world order and national societies we end up sort of encountering. And that would be, I think, a depressing path to go down on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll just add very briefly that, I mean, at some point, if we continue like this and an immediate vaccine isn't developed that's immediately available for everybody, there will be hard trade-offs governments need to make between quote-unquote lives and livelihoods. These kinds of lockdowns simply can't continue, or for long, or the effects will, the remedy will be worse than the disease for all the people who live from their labor income day to day. That's simply not possible, and there will have to be some kind of a balance, and governments will have to do that. I don't think there's inherent trade-off between liberties and public health measures. I think democracies ideally have a way to adjudicate that simply politicians can use that as a strategy to, you know, become more autocratic or, you know, foment sort of attacks against their opponents, etc. That's all.
Thank you.
Okay. Of course, we all know that we are speculating right now. It's like probably based on our own research, but still, we don't know. When we talk about the future, the future is a big unknown. It's very hard to know the present. The future is almost impossible to know. But I cannot. I wish I could be more optimist. Probably I'm an optimist in the long run, but the medium term or short run, I think this pandemic will be a big hit on liberal democracies. The core values of the liberal democracies are being challenged. Just think about ourselves 1 year ago. How would we feel that all the governments in the world would say you have to stay in your house, you cannot move, you cannot go outside, and you cannot protest, or you should not protest, and you cannot travel. And I cannot, it's very hard to me to see this as a good thing for liberal democracies. I think this is going against the values of liberal democracies, and after that, maybe a miracle will come, but all the specialists are saying that the vaccine will take at least 1 year to start to be distributed. So we have been in this situation for 3 months, and a lot of things have changed. I don't know if there's any country in the world that's gonna experience economic growth this year. I don't think so. Maybe New Zealand, but most countries will have like a 10% drops in their GDPs. I don't see how this can be good for democracy. I think increase social protests, people will be unhappy, and we know from previous crises. If you think about the last big pandemic, you know, the history after that was not great. You know, the history after the Spanish flu was not wonderful. But we are just a small part of, we are very small, and humanity will find its way. So probably our next years won't be great. You know, both in social and political and economic terms, but in the long term, things will get better. But we will have to go through this bad moment. I'm sorry to have this opinion. So that's it.
Thank you so much for all of your perspectives and points of view on the relation between the global pandemic and democracy or regime type or state reactions more generally. So we can see that there's already a number of findings, but as we are still in an ongoing situation, of course, there will be a lot still to be explored in the future when it comes to this relation between democracy and the global health crisis. And obviously, as we know, in liberal democracies, there is a lot of concern as Gabriel just mentioned, related to restrictions that are imposed on individual liberties. And the question is, how long is that sustainable? Of course, one would assume that in the liberal democracies that there is no strategy behind, in the sense of dismantling democracies, as we can see in some hybrid regimes or more authoritarian type of regimes. Still, a number of citizens, with the duration of this crisis extending, are becoming more and more concerned. And we can see that even in countries such as Germany, where concerned citizens now have taken to the streets to voice their concerns about the validity of the constitution, etc. And so, as we've also heard in this debate, in hybrid regimes or more authoritarian-leaning regimes, we also have cases where the pandemic is taken as a pretext to restrict even further political liberties, to use that almost as an opportunity. And furthermore, we also have to think about more long-term implications. Kind of, these are more immediate implications, like, are our individual liberties restricted in that situation, and then for what, for good purposes or with kind of bad intentions behind it. And then the more long-term effects is what are the effects of the social and economic consequences of the pandemic on the one hand, and then also of these restrictive measures that bring the economy, have brought the economy to a halt in most countries of the world. What are the implications of that for social inequality, for poverty, for unemployment? And how does that again then have repercussions for the stability of political regimes? So this is, again, we cannot know this yet. We can speculate on the basis of like previous experiences, for example, or on the basis that the data that we already had related to the early phase of the pandemic. But of course, we cannot know for sure. And so for us as scholars of democracy or public policy or social sciences in general, it will be interesting to follow this process further. And I would like to invite everybody in the audience to bring your own perspective and to reflect on this issue and to observe what's going on in your country and in your world region.